Good evening. My name is Stephen Sepp Corson. This is Dead or Alive, presented by the Somerville Producers Group. Tonight we have as our guest Professor Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics, and for 30 years a very prominent and influential critic of American policy and of injustice around the world. Tonight we'll be discussing the role and the power of the media in this country and the influences that it has on our lives that we may not realize. And my first question, Professor, is about the title of your book, Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies. When people hear those terms of thought control and propaganda, most often they associate those with more totalitarian societies and certainly not democratic societies. Could you explain those terms and what that means?
Well, actually, the basic idea is given by the title, which is actually not mine. I borrowed it from Reinhold Niebuhr, who's a very distinguished moralist and foreign affairs analyst. He was known as the theologian of the establishment. He was the guru of the Kennedys and the Cambridge intellectuals, George Kennan, and so on. And he expressed the view that it's the task of the intellectuals, people who he called the cool observers, to create necessary illusions and emotionally potent oversimplifications for the general public. The reason is that the general public are naive and naive simpletons, and you've got to ensure that they don't get involved in managing their own affairs or participating in the political system or making decisions and so on. It would be immoral to do that, as it would be immoral to let a 3-year-old run across the street. You have to take care of them, and the way you take care of them is by creating these illusions, these necessary illusions that kind of keep the silly people on course. And that's a very standard idea, actually. That's a kind of a leading idea of a good deal of liberal democratic theory. So actually the previous book that a friend and I wrote right before this was called Manufacturing Consent, and we borrowed that term from Walter Lippman, who's the Dean of American Journalists, and his conception was that the general population are what he called the bewildered herd, and he said we have to protect ourselves. We smart guys have to protect ourselves from the rage and trampling of the bewildered herd.
It reminds me of another term by Aldous Huxley, which was downward transcendence by means of herd intoxication.
Yes, right.
Regarding fascism or fascist ideas.
Yeah, but they're talking about democratic societies.
Yes.
And the idea is that in a totalitarian society, you really don't need that much propaganda, or the propaganda can be relatively crude. And the reason is because you can control the population by force. And in a military-run society or a feudal society or a modern totalitarian society, you can have a ministry of truth which produces obvious propaganda. Everybody knows that it's propaganda, and they can choose to believe it or not choose to believe it as they wish, but they can't do much about it because you've got the bludgeon to beat them with.
Right,
but as a society becomes more free and more democratic, you have to keep the bewildered herd under control in other ways, and the way to do it is through propaganda and through manufacturing consent and construction of illusions and oversimplifications and or simply marginalization. A large part of the task of the media is simply to direct people away from issues. So keep them focused on sitcoms and spectator sports or something, anything, as long as they don't get involved in something that might be serious. And this goes from every level, from kind of imposing the values of a highly individualistic consumer culture where the only value is individual greed and people never do anything for one another and so on. That's one aspect, all the way up to concocting a framework of a delusionary framework for the interpretation of domestic and international affairs. And different parts of the media have a different role to play in this respect. Incidentally, these ideas are not modern.
Right.
They go back to the to the earliest modern democratic revolutions. The first real modern democratic revolution was in the 17th century in England, when there were, for the first time, radical ministers and tradesmen were producing pamphlet literature and organizing people and reaching out to the general public for the first time. And they had real, highly radical democratic ideas. I mean, they were talking about the rights of ordinary people to control their own lives, universal education and access to health and all sorts, and a lot of which is still not, still far on the agenda. And that had to be suppressed because the people, as they put it in those days, are getting so arrogant that they are refusing to submit to a civil rule and have to be repressed. And that same idea reappears over and over again. In the American Revolution, for example, the general public, after the revolution had won, the general public had to be taught that the ideas that appeared in the revolutionary pamphlets about freedom and equality were not to be taken seriously. Popular uprisings, like, say, Shays' Rebellion in New England of rebellious farmers, had to be crushed by force. Those guys were taking this libertarian rhetoric seriously, and they had to be taught that the way it works is different. This country was founded on the idea that the people who own the country ought to govern it. That phrase is John Jay's, the president of the Constitutional Convention. Modalities had to be worked out to ensure that the people who own the place also govern it. With the rise of modern corporations, it took new forms. The ideas keep being remodeled and reshaped. In the 20th century, it became just a major industry. In the early part of the 20th century, the public relations industry was created, and it's grown into a huge industry. And it's very frank about what it does. In fact, its leading figure, Edward Bernays, lives right here in Cambridge.
Yes.
He wrote back in the 1920s, I suppose, about what he called the engineering of consent, which he said is the essence of democracy. He wrote a book called Propaganda, in fact, in which he described the way you have to control people's thinking. Controlling the public mind is the concern of the advertising industry, and has been from its origins, puts lots of money and thought into their main concern, actually, is to create a public climate of support for business rule and business profitability, to break labor unions, to break the working class culture that at one time existed, and so on.
Well, how would the informed public jeopardize that or threaten that?
How would it jeopardize that? Well, you ask all sorts of questions, like, why do we need bosses, for example? Why can't we run things ourselves? Why should there be rich people, living in mansions while other people are homeless in the streets? Why should some people have access to health care and others starve and not have access to it? Why should we pour money into creating stealth bombers instead of using it for schools and houses? All kinds of questions immediately come to mind, and the bewildered herd are likely to ask them if they're permitted to have an honest look at the world. I mean, take, say, just the last 10 years. The general public was strongly opposed to the Reagan programs on virtually every issue by very large margins. I mean, right through the Reagan years, if you take a look at this, is a very heavily polled society. The reason is that business wants to keep its finger on the public pulse, so it knows how to adjust the propaganda, in fact. There's extensive polling data. It shows that right through the Reagan years, the public was, when people are asked, would you prefer spending for military purposes or for or social spending like health and education and welfare and so on, by huge margins, the public preferred social spending, 4 to 1 or 7 to 1, depending on how you ask. In fact, majority of the population was in favor of higher taxes if it was used for those purposes, which is quite unusual. People rarely are in favor of higher taxes. But the policies, nevertheless, were quite the opposite. The policies were to dismantle and destroy the limited support system that there was, and to transfer resources from the poor to the rich. The 1980s were a decade of outright robbery, in which the poorer part of the population was robbed, which is the great majority, were robbed outright to enrich a small sector. That's why Tom Wolfe in the Boston Globe the other day described the 80s as one of the golden moments of human history. For people like him, it was a golden moment of human history. They were robbing everybody blind. And if you don't care about, homeless people and mutilated bodies in Central America and so on, well, it's just a golden moment. Look how rich I'm getting. Now, the point is that, if any of this was presented to the general public in a regular, intelligible fashion, they would want to do something about it. And in the United States, which is a relatively free society, you can't control them by force. So they better not know about it.
Well,
they better not think about it.
Well, many people know that these problems exist. I think that they just don't, most people don't really know how to respond to them, or maybe they're conditioned not to.
Problems exist, but it is a very distorted way to look at it, at least. I mean, it's very hard to know exactly what people have to ask themselves what they know and understand, but we can see what's presented. So, for example, take the Boston Globe again. The other day they had a couple of weeks ago, I guess, there was a comical front page story about the economic crisis in Massachusetts, and it was about a man whose name I've forgotten, who was telling about how impossible their life is. Can't exist. He only makes $56,000 a year, and he was having a tough time keeping his 2 cars up, and they didn't have enough time to spend in his swimming pool, and they only had 2 houses, and his wife even had to work, to sort of, and she didn't want to, and this was really terrible. And then he went on to say how awful everything else is. The roads are no good, and the schools are collapsing, and so on and so forth. What was the problem? Well, the problem is big government. Put aside the question of what the problem is for a man who's making $56,000 a year. Let's grant he has a problem. But why is the problem big government? Well, doubtless there's corruption in government, but there's 1,000 times as much corruption in business. And for every, bit of excessive spending in government, there's 1,000 times that much that goes into superinflated salaries and idiotic managerial practices that have led to the decline of the productive system in order to maximize rapid gain and so on. But he didn't say the problem's in the business system. And in fact, nobody would say, you would never see that in the newspapers. There's lots of attack on the corruption of government, doubtless real, but so marginal as to be insignificant. On the other hand, the fact that we have a business community that extracts huge profits and leads to, and has a sector of the population living in extraordinary luxury while making in fact owning the country and also governing it and directing policy in a way which maximizes their profit but happens to be extremely destructive for the general population and future generations. That's not what this man complained about, because it's not presented to you every day, and the world isn't shaped in those terms. That's one of the things you don't look at. Even when people talk about the media, they talk about, there's criticism of the media for something. Occasionally there'll be criticism of the media for being too soft on the government, not being adversarial enough. How about criticism of the media for being patsies for business, for the corporate system? You never see a criticism like that. That's just one of the things you're not allowed to discuss.
I think the most dominant criticism of the media would tend to be that it's too liberal or too
Exactly.
left-wing.
The usual criticism is it's too adversarial. But when you see a criticism from the other side, says, no, it's not too adversarial. It's that it's too subordinated to government. You will occasionally hear that. But that it's too subordinated to corporate interests, that's unspeakable. Those words, that's not an English sentence. You can't say that.
Right.
Because corporate interests don't exist. They're part of the, they're behind some curtain, and you don't talk about them. You can talk about the government being bad occasionally, and you can criticize the government. But the government is just, it's just one segment of the business class. That's all it is. And the real problem is basically in John Jay's dictum, the dictum on which the country was founded. If those who own the country are going to govern it, which in fact is essentially what happens, you want to look at who owns it, not just that particular set of managers who happens to be running it today.
Yeah, you have written that resources come from the real source of power in this country, from ownership. Those who own the productive assets of the country ultimately have the capacity to determine what else functions. Now, how, in terms of, again, getting back to the media, how would those systems be maintained or be reinforced in, in a daily way and
how does it
television?
work, you mean?
Excuse me?
You mean how does it work out? Or?
How does it, well, how is it reinforced if you say that that's something that is promoted or that's...
Well, I mean, there are two levels at which you can discuss this, and you tell me which one you mean. I mean, one, we can talk about how the, how do the institutions work out so that, in fact, the picture of the world is shaped in corporate interests. That's one. And secondly, how are particular stories dealt with, or particular issues?
I think I'm interested in both. I think it is.
Well, the first one is pretty straightforward, and in fact, it's not very mysterious. Just simply one just simply has to ask oneself, what are the media? Okay, so what are the major media? Let's take, say, the television channels or the cable channels or the big newspapers and so on. What are they? Answer, very simple, they're big corporations. In fact, for the major media, huge corporations. What's more, they're integrated into even bigger conglomerates, like General Electric and Westinghouse and so on. Huge, among the real huge conglomerates. Now, like any other corporations, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is what keeps them going. Well, what's the market? The market's advertisers. That's what funds the media. They're not funded by people who read them or look at them. Like when you turn on the tube, CBS doesn't get a cent out of it. They're financed by the advertisers. In fact, same with newspapers. You may pay 50 cents, but usually they lose money for every issue that they sell. It's the advertisers who keep them going. So what you have is big corporations selling a product to other corporations. Well, what's the product? The product is audiences. If you sell upscale audiences, you get more profit because there's no point advertising a Mercedes in the slums. So if you want to you want to sell a good product that's going to make a lot of money, sell rich audiences, privileged audiences. And in fact, that's what the one sector of the media, like the national media, basically, the New York Times, the Washington Post, those things, and the Boston Globe for that matter, they basically are selling privileged audiences. And they're the ones who set the agenda. Like if you're running a small newspaper and say, a big newspaper for that matter in Des Moines, Iowa or something, you don't have the resources to cover the world scene or even the national scene. What you do is you see what the New York Times has. You do the same thing.
Or the wire services.
Well, see, it's actually interesting. Now, if you watch the wire services, I don't know if you've got an AP wire here, let it run, and around 4 o'clock in the afternoon every day, something comes across which says, the New York Times is planning the following for their front page tomorrow. Every editor in the country sees that and he says, okay, here's the news for tomorrow, X, Y, and Z, because that's what the New York Times is doing. In fact, even the television channels do that. They see what's on the New York Times and the Washington Post that morning, and that's what you're going to see in the evening. I mean, they're a little more independent than a small newspaper, but that's the way the thing works. So there is a sort of a core of kind of agenda-setting newspapers. There is also kind of a local quality press, like, say, the Globe or the Philadelphia Inquirer or the LA Times, and they have a degree they have enough resources so that they have a degree of independence, although they don't break far out of that framework either. And then you sort of go on down to people who just pick up the structure, and either they use the New York Times, like, say, if you have the Boston Herald, you just run the New York Times news service. That's your view of the world. I doubt if they have their own correspondence anywhere. So on the one hand, you've got these kind of agenda-setting media, which are selling privileged audiences. And then you have the mass media, which are selling huge audiences and just sort of pick up the structure from above. Well, what do you expect to come out of that? Let's take the agenda-setting media. Huge corporations selling privileged audiences to other businesses. What kind of picture of the world do you expect to come out of that system? Well, you expect a picture that's going to reflect the interests of the sellers and the buyers and the product, namely to reflect to give a view of the world that serves the interests and the needs of the sectors of the population that in fact control the resources and make the decisions, and they're the economic managers and the political managers and the cultural managers, the people who are in the culture business, schools, universities, media, and so on, reflects their interests. That's a top sector of the population. at an extreme level. It's the kind of people who Tom Wolfe was talking for. But it's, it's the privilege. Now let's take the other sectors of the media. And they have a job. I mean, their job is to, those media have, their job is first of all to set the agenda in a way which will serve those interests, pick the stories, frame them, suppress them, modify them in such a way that it will serve the interests of privilege, which they do, but also to indoctrinate their own audience. They got to indoctrinate them, because those people, the people in decision-making positions, they have to accept the values and the interests and the understanding of the real bosses, the people who actually are the corporate management and ownership.
Well, it would seem to me that that class that you say that some of this is being directed to is small and probably, in fact, is becoming smaller. That very wealthy class, whereas the larger and expanding part of the population would be a lower class or a middle class.
And see, the real mass media are directed to the what I've been talking about so far is maybe 20% of the population, which is subordinated to the interests of a few percent who really own the resources. What about the other 80%? Well, they're the ones who are fed the rest of the media. And the task of the media, as far as they're concerned, is in part to just inculcate the right patriotic slogans and make sure they don't look at the wrong things, like people enriching themselves at their interest and so on. You put that away. But besides that, just divert them. Divert the bewildered herd and make sure that they don't get involved in anything that might be unfortunate, like running their own affairs. So basically a large part of the media is diversion, and it's also isolation. You want to make sure that everybody's alone. Each person is sitting alone in front of the tube. You don't support one another. You don't have any organizations where you get together and try to work things out and do things. Unions, for example. I mean, one of the major propaganda, very conscious propaganda efforts of the public relations industry was to destroy the unions.
When did that begin?
That began, well, it's actually the United States has a very violent labor history. So it began way back. In fact, and we also have a highly class-conscious business class. In fact, if you read the business literature, it's kind of like Marxist literature. It's all about class warfare and the masses and so on. Except they're on the other side. You got to win the class war, by suppressing the masses. And they're worried about the power of the masses and so on. It's the only place in American, reading material where it reads like kind of vulgar Marxism, except upside down. Back in the 19th century, from the 19th century, there's been a real battle. Now, American labor lost it. I mean, there was a long war, and labor struggled for a long time to gain things like, say, the 40-hour week. Finally gained it, but no longer. In fact, unionization has declined very far, and what's more, the working class culture has declined. The extent to which this is, just take, say, for example, May Day. If you ask people, I ask my classes every year, April 30th, what's tomorrow? And it's the day when you dance around the maypole or something. The United States is, I think, probably the only country in the world where May Day is not a working class holiday. Everywhere else in the world, May Day is a working class holiday. Well, what's it celebrating? What May Day is celebrating is it's a holiday established by the international working class movement in solidarity with the struggles of American workers. It was in solidarity with the struggles of American workers for an 8-hour day over 100 years ago. Now, the United States is the only country where it's not celebrated. In fact, we have a working class holiday. It's Labor Day. It's a day when you go back to work.
Right. It's at the end of the summer.
That's when the summer's over. Now, forget fishing. You go back to work. Now, see, those things are not just they're symbolic in a way, but they reflect the enormous victory of the business classes over any conception of popular organization or popular solidarity, or just the idea that people have a right to the fruits of their own labor or to struggle together to achieve something. That's got to be completely destroyed. And all that's left is the right of the rich to enrich themselves while nobody's looking. And that's, in fact, what the public relations industry and advertising is dedicated to, and what a large part of the mass media are dedicated to.
Well, I think back to a time, like, for example, looking at life magazines of the 40s and the during the war, when there was very intensive propaganda and very blatant propaganda, and looking at any of the, you know, magazines of that time, for example, as I said, Life magazine, there's very intensive propaganda about, you know, caricatures of Hitler and so on. And I think immediately after that, and in the 30s, there was a bit of an experiment with socialism in this country, at least on one level. But then, immediately after the war, again, to look at some of these magazines and see the intensity of the propaganda effort to shift people's values and to much more of a consumer orientation and so on.
Associated incidentally with a big attack on unions,
starting
right after the war, and an effort to roll back what had been gained by the working class and the poor during the 30s.
And women's roles.
It was very self-conscious. I mean, the business literature is full of discussion of how to do it. They had begun in the late 30s working out one thing was called the Johnstown formula, which was a technique that was used to break a major strike in 1937 by enlisting public opinion and using the media, in fact, to undermine popular support for the strikers and what they were fighting for, which was in fact the interests of most of the population. That was considered a big success. During the war, of course, this was all put on hold because he had another job. But immediately after the war, there was a major attack by business, government, the intellectual classes, and so on, to destroy the unions, the working class culture, solidarity, popular organization, and to restore centralized power at the hands of the privileged. That led to the quiet period of the 50s. When popular movements began again in the 60s, the same thing happened. In fact, there's a very interesting book that everybody ought to read called The Crisis of Democracy, put together by a group called the Trilateral Commission, which is basically the international liberal establishment.
At what time was that?
This was 1975 when the book came out. And it's the people around Carter. In fact, Jimmy Carter and virtually his entire administration came out of that. So it's the kind of liberal wing of the international ruling class. Trilateral meant United States, Europe, and Japan. And they were all concerned with the same question. They were concerned with the ferment of the 60s, when our crisis of democracy arose. Well, what was the crisis? Now, if you read it, it's very, very enlightened. They were talking to each other, so everybody was very frank. Nobody was expected to read this book. The crisis was that people were organizing. Sectors of the population that are usually passive and apathetic were beginning to enter the political arena. Ethnic minorities, women, young people, poor people. I mean, people were just getting together and trying to organize and get into things and put.
Within the Democratic Party as well, after the crisis in the 1968 election and everything that happened in Chicago, by the 1972 election, there was at least temporarily, the party had been restructured in order.
Yeah, and that was called the crisis. The crisis was that democracy was beginning to work. And in fact, the spokesman for the United States, who happens to be a big professor at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, he said that he described sort of the good old days when you didn't have a crisis. He said Truman had been able to run the country with the assistance of a small group of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. Then there was no crisis. Everything was the way it was supposed to be. But now you couldn't just get a bunch of bankers and Wall Street lawyers together and do everything, because you had all these annoying people. You had this bewildered herd getting involved. And that's a crisis. And how do you solve the crisis? Well, you restore the population to apathy and obedience. And then you don't have a crisis of democracy anymore. Then democracy is working just fine, working in the interests of the privileged. It's by the privileged, for the privileged, and in their interests. That's democracy. And when that gets out of hand, you have a problem. Well, that's the same idea, the thought that we've been hearing since the 17th century. And every time you get popular involvement and action and organization, you get an attempt to crush it. In the United States, it's been quite successful. The people really are marginalized and isolated. The United States, I mean, what I mentioned about May Day is a case in point, but the United States has one of the weakest labor movements in the world. It's the only industrial society, virtually the only industrial society that doesn't have a labor-based party. We really have a one-party system, if we were honest. We have a business party. One of the populist mayors in the Midwest, Mayor Cleveland, recently called it the demi-publicans, you know, business party. That's two factions, and they kind of shift around a little bit. But it's what would be called the conservatives or the Tories in almost any other industrial country. There's no working class party. There's no, I doubt if there's a, I mean, you'd have to really look hard in the United States to find any writer in a journal who identify himself or herself as a socialist. Virtually no one. Every other industrial society, it's just a joke. It's normal. I mean, Canada, England, anywhere.
In terms of that, and in terms of that, and the press, and people who are within the press, as you say, a journalist, mentioned about the socialist journalist as an example. How is it that the perspective in the news that we see is as narrow as it is?
How is it?
How is that reinforced, would you say? Is it the, I've recently read a study about the people who are presented as experts in the media having a very narrow spectrum.
Well, that's true, but and there was a study in Mother Jones this month, and a media analysis group also did a study of people in Nightline or something, and it's true, yeah, of course, picked from a pretty narrow spectrum, but I think that kind of is misleading in a way, although it's correct. The point is that the entire spectrum is narrow.
Yes.
So, for example, I've done a lot of, well, for example, in this book, I do some analysis on various issues. So, you know, the big foreign policy issue of the 1980s was Nicaragua, what do you do about Nicaragua? I took the two periods of peak concentration, which, if you look at, you know, the number of news stories and so on, it sort of peaked in early 1986 and in early 1987. That was in connection with Contra aid bills. So I took all the opinion columns in the newspapers, main newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, all the op-eds and the editor and the, you know, their columnists and so on. That's supposed to give the range of opinion, and there were lots of them. There were about close to 150 columns. So how did they divide up on the issue? Well, on the major issue, what's your attitude toward the Sandinistas? It was totalitarian, 100%. 100% in the first sample, 100% of the columns were anti-Sandinista. In the second sample, 1987, there were two exceptions. One of them was the ambassador of Nicaragua, who was allowed to write a column, and the other was the only person who had had first-hand experience in Central America, a doctor in New York, Kevin Cahill, who's a specialist in tropical medicine and has worked in Haiti and the Caribbean and the Central America, and he was the one person who said, look, it's the only place where they've carried out health programs directed to the poor population. They've had an enormous increase in lifespan, huge decline in infant mortality because they're actually trying to do something for people. Those were the two columns in the whole sample that were not anti-Sandinista. Now, you know, that's the kind of unanimity you get in a totalitarian state. Now, furthermore, it's kind of interesting to see the topics that weren't mentioned. Like, you know, whatever your attitude may be toward the Sandinistas, there's one rather striking property that differentiates them from, say, the government of El Salvador and Guatemala or even Honduras. Namely, they don't slaughter their own population. In El Salvador and Guatemala, and even to a lesser extent Honduras, the government's essentially run by the army. And the army's a gang of murderers, you know, U.S.-trained and U.S.-supported murderers who've killed tens of thousands of people. There's been a huge, massive slaughter there. Well, whatever you think about the Sandinistas, they haven't done that. So how much, in fact, their record is much better than even Honduras in this respect. Well, how much coverage did that get? Answer, not one phrase in all of the columns. That shows how important mass slaughter and terror and torture are for elite values. Another a factor which is not in question is that the Sandinistas, again, whatever you think about them, did carry out social reforms, and they had quite a significant impact until they were cut back by U.S. terrorism. How much did that get? Well, you know, scattered phrases, maybe in the first sample 2 phrases in a very negative context. In the second, the 2 columns I mentioned indicated it. That shows how important social reform are. The third point that is interesting is international law. I mean, the World Court ruled that U.S. actions in Nicaragua were criminal, that we were engaged in the unlawful use of force, and that the embargo was illegal, and that what we're calling humanitarian aid is military aid. Now, that's the highest world tribunal, you know, the International Court of Justice. How much attention was paid to that? Virtually zero. You put all this together and you get a picture. I won't go on. You get a picture of a society which is virtually totalitarian in its conformity to the needs of power, which cares nothing about terror and violence as long as it's carried out for a constructive purpose.
In fact, you mentioned in your book about, in a lecture, that there was accusations of aiding the guerrillas from Colombia that were just completely fabricated.
Yeah, I mean, there was a big story in the New York Times ran a big series on Nicaraguan support for guerrillas in Colombia. Colombian government denied it, said there's nothing like that ever happened. That was never reported, and they continued to publish the accusations. It got to the point where they even had a big editorial a couple of months after this event, which denounced the Sandinistas for support for the guerrillas, and it said, in fact, they had a mass. They carried out a mass in Nicaragua for the guerrillas, some of them who'd been killed in an army operation. A reader in Arizona was curious about that, and he wrote the New York Times a letter asking them if they could give him some information about this mass. He kept at it. You know, they never published his letter, but he kept at it, and finally they conceded, the foreign editor conceded privately that they would never publish it, that what actually happened was that there was a mass for something else. And in the mass, somebody got up in the back of the room with a poster about the guerrillas and was taken out. That's what happened. So that becomes Nicaraguan support for the guerrillas and running a mass for them. Well, they conceded it in private, but they never made a correction. And it just goes on and on like this. I mean, I'm picking one issue. You pick any issue in the world and you'll get the same story. These are the operations of a well-organized propaganda system with perfectly obvious objectives. It's a very interesting case, the United States, because it's done without force. Nobody's forcing them to do it. You know, nobody's got a gun at their heads. This is done out of interest. You know, it's done out of interest and out of institutional need. So it's not totalitarian. It's done under conditions of freedom. That's what I mean by thought control in a democratic society.
I see. Well, we're planning to take some questions from the people that are here in our studio to discuss some of the topics we've been discussing tonight and some other questions, and perhaps we can take the first question now.
Hi, Dr. Chomsky.
Hi.
I'd just like to ask what you think the necessary illusions are that are supported by the media's anti-Sandinista bias in Nicaragua.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very clear, actually. There's if we had something that you could call newspapers in the United States, they would tell you what drives American policy towards the Third World and towards Central America, and that's very explicit. This is a free country. You can, the major planning documents have been declassified. You can find out what they say, and here's what they say. They say that the major threat, they say that the roots of American policy in Latin America are the primary root is the economic root, the trade and investment there. They say that the major threat to U.S. interests is what are called nationalistic regimes, which are responsive to the needs of the masses of the population for improvement in living standards and diversification of production for domestic needs. Why is that a threat? Because we have to impose a climate favorable to private business, including guarantees for repatriation of profits, for foreign investment. It says we have to protect our resources And the documents say right back, including the doves, people like George Kennan, we have to support police states if necessary, because liberal regimes will be too indulgent to people carrying out these negative actions. Well, it goes on and on like that. This is repeated over and over again in the highest level planning documents. It's applied repeatedly throughout the world. That's why we've continually had to overthrow democratic governments, capitalist governments, in fact, when they became too devoted to their own, to the needs of their own populations. Well, you know, that's what the Sandinistas were. The Sandinistas were directing resources to the general population and away from the elites, and they weren't protecting the interests of the business community, so they have to go. On that, there's unanimity. The only question is how they go. So you have a tactical debate between the people who say, let's do it by terror and violence, let's support the Contras, and then the doves who say, let's do it by economic strangulation and ideological warfare. But that they must go, that's certain. How often have you read an editorial or an opinion column in the United States saying the Sandinistas are doing good? You know, I mean, you can certainly find people who say it. For example, Oxfam, you know, the major development and aid organization, has described the policies of the Sandinistas as unique in the 76 developing countries in which they work, in their concern for the needs of the population and the efficiency with which they address them. But they don't write an op-ed, because that's not a permissible position.
Shall we take the next question, please?
I'm wondering, you cited this Gallup poll that said that a majority of Americans are in favor of funding social programs and are willing to raise taxes to pay for them. I'm wondering why, in your mind, Democratic candidates who stand for those things keep losing, particularly presidential candidates.
There aren't any. There's no presidential candidate who stands for those things. For example, right at the time when that's what the polls were saying, the Democrats were saying, let's do the opposite.
Well, Mondale, for example.
Mondale didn't say that. Mondale didn't. In fact, Mondale did not. Mondale's position was he was in favor of cutting back military spending, but also cutting back social spending. And the reason was because in 1984, the Democrats were basically the party of fiscal conservatism. They were the party that was representing the interests of the banks and the investment firms and so on, who were concerned with the big deficits. The Republicans were the party of what's called Keynesian growth. You know, big government, lots of government spending. That's what the military means. Big subsidies to high-tech industry. That's what the Pentagon basically is. Let's forget the deficits. In fact, the two parties had switched their usual positions 180 degrees, but none of them were talking about dropping military spending in favor of social spending. You can't do that. Military spending is the way we keep high-tech industry going. In fact, Reagan's military spending programs were just basically the Carter programs. They were proposed in the last year or two of the Carter administration, and they were implemented under Reagan. And the reasons were because the business community all fundamentally had the same opinion, that you have to figure out a way to increase profitability of corporations, cut back social spending, and force the public to subsidize advanced industry. I mean, there's one sector of American industry that's basically competitive, high-tech industry, you know, computers and all that sort of thing, electronics. And you've got to get the public to pay for it. The public has to pay for research and development and has to, you know, has to subsidize the costly parts. Then if there's any profit to be made, that goes back to private enterprise. What we call free enterprise is actually publicly subsidized private profit. It happens to be done through the Pentagon system here. And on that there was unanimity. Everyone was agreed, you know, virtually across the board, that you had to cut back social programs and increase military spending, that is, high-tech subsidies. Didn't matter what the public thought.
Do you feel that there were any issues raised in the Jackson campaign?
Oh yeah, sure. There were issues raised in the Jackson campaign, but you know, they were not presented. I mean, the presentation of Jackson in the media didn't present those issues. It avoided them in favor of other things. Like,
and
did he make an anti-Semitic remark? Right. Or, you know, did he say this? Did he say that? But not what the populist content of the programs was.
Next question, please.
Doesn't it appear that the working class is in fact not being pacified anymore and being squeezed right out of the arena? And whose aims would that serve?
Is it not being squeezed out?
I mean, the working class are being pushed further and further rather than being pacified to the point where they're hardly earning a living wage, many people now.
Well, that's pacification. I mean, I'm not sure I understand. Yes, you're right. They're being very much suppressed, but they're also being pacified. I mean, labor militancy is at a pretty low level, even though the working class has been suffering. Like, for example, look, real wages, the amount you actually can buy for what an hour's work gives you, that's been declining since about 1973. Right. That's unprecedented in American history. It's never happened before. Meanwhile, the richer sectors of the population, especially in the 80s, their incomes have been going way up. Their economic value has been going way up. Nevertheless, the reaction, the working class, the reaction to this on the part of the working class and the poor is pretty limited. I mean, it's not zero.
Isn't that fuel for something to happen eventually?
Pardon?
One would think that is fuel for something to eventually.
Well, I mean, the point of the goal of the cultural system is to prevent it from happening by preventing people from even seeing it. So I don't think people are in general aware of the fact that living standards for the mass of the population are regularly going down, and that it's going to be even worse in the future because the enrichment of the rich is taking place at the expense of future generations. That's what the deficits amount to. But you know, that's not presented. I mean, you know, if you look at the figures, you can see it. In fact, if you look at your lives, most people can see it. But they are not presented with this characterization of the world on a daily basis. You may find an article on page 78 someday that, you know, says something about it. But what is not presented is this ought to be this ought to be up front. This ought to be the headlines. Ought to be presented daily, so you see what's happening to your world. And that's not being done. If that were happening, you probably would get labor militancy.
Next question.
Well, I suppose my question follows from that. I'd like you to describe the marginalization of the criticism. It's not merely lack of access. There's a whole host of things that are happening in order for these things not to be brought to everyone's attention.
How does it work?
Yes.
The marginalization? Well, you know, there are plenty of critics around, but they occasionally talk on community access
TV, yes.
TV or on community-supported radio stations. For example, around the country where there are listener-supported radio stations. I don't mean like WGBH where you send in your $10 and they do whatever they feel like, but I mean really community-supported radio stations where you send in your $10 and then you play a role in deciding what they do, and there's interaction. Towns and cities that have that are rather different. I spend a lot of time traveling around the country, and when you go to a place like, say, Boulder, Colorado, or, you know, Madison, Wisconsin, or some place that has a lively listener-supported radio station, you feel the difference in the popular culture because people do have a way of participating and presented to them on a regular daily basis an alternative picture of the world which reflects their interests and their concerns and, in fact, reality. That doesn't happen in places like Boston. And where there are individual critics, they will, of course, be very much marginalized. Well, take, say, that book that was mentioned. That book was actually based on lectures that were given over the national radio in Canada, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. A big series of lectures every year that was given there. Then the book was published in Canada, and it's on the bestseller list in Canada. In the United States, in Boston, it was also published in Boston, but the Boston Globe wouldn't even list it under the listing of books by local authors, you know, local boy makes good type list that they have every Sunday where, you know, if you write a chapter in a cookbook, they have you listed there. But and of course there couldn't be a review in the United States. It's inconceivable. Nobody would have heard of it. Well, that's the difference. And that happens across the board. I mean, my colleague Edward Herman and I, who wrote the Manufacturing Consent book, our first book was published by a publisher that was owned by Warner Communications, who also owns this outfit. They didn't like that book. They didn't want the publisher to distribute it. 20,000 copies had been printed. The publisher, which was a successful publisher, insisted on printing it. They put the publisher out of business. They literally put them out of business and destroyed their whole stock to prevent them from distributing that one book.
That was your book?
That's Warner Communications. Now that's extreme. Things usually don't get that far, and I don't want to suggest that that's typical. But there's a whole range of ways to ensure that unless you conform to the basic doctrines of the system, you're not going to be heard. There's a mechanism that begins in kindergarten that starts filtering people out for obedience and conformity. It goes for the schools and the colleges and the professions. And if you pass through those filters, you can take part. And if you start deviating, you'll be cut off.
Let's take our next question, please.
Yeah, I'd just like you to comment on, well, this is an observation. I think probably the people who most buy the necessary illusions are probably the ones who would be most surprised to be considered in the bewildered herds. Like people who feel that they're educated, probably make $56,000 a year, etc. My take on things is that marginalized groups don't buy the necessary illusions, and their jargon and everything else reflects that. Could you comment on how you think their role could be, the role of marginalized groups in the United States?
And remember, the marginalized groups is the large majority of the population.
Fragmented, yeah.
Fragmented, but put them together, that's the overwhelming majority. I think your point is right. It's kind of hard to prove because the polls don't ask the right questions, but my impression is exactly like yours, that the educated part of the population is the most indoctrinated and the most deluded. And I think there are good reasons for that. They're the ones who are subjected to the indoctrination regularly on a daily basis. To be educated means to be bombarded with propaganda, distortion, illusions all the time. For most of the population, you see what's in your lives, and you can't be deluded about the things I've just been talking about because it's right in front of your nose. And you're not bombarded by the regular propaganda because you're considered too unimportant. You're just pushed to the side. So what can these people do? Well, they can create exactly the crisis of democracy that elites are worried about. They can become organized. They can enter the political arena. They can begin to, they can take over the political system by their numbers, as they should. And in fact, they can take over the system of production as well. After all, why do you need bosses and managers? What role do they serve other than to enrich themselves and to distort the process of production for the interests of the wealthy? That's it. Let's face it. And there's no other need for them. And as long as you have, there's no law of nature that says that the people in a factory can't run the factory. In fact, they can do it better than the manager. They know better what's going on, and so on and so forth. Now, when those issues become on the agenda, you'll have a real crisis of democracy, and in fact, you'll complete the revolutions that began in the 18th century and then were cut off.
Professor Chomsky, we have time for one more question.
I just wonder if the opening of the so-called Iron Curtain threatens any of our necessary illusions, and if you foresee any changes as a result of that.
Well, what's happening behind the Iron Curtain is a very exciting development, too much to talk about, but the way the West is looking at it, they want to convert Eastern Europe into a kind of a third world. So the idea is to convert Eastern Europe into Mexico and Dominican Republic and so on, make them easy to rob. That's the basic idea. So they too can provide markets and resources and cheap labor and so on and so forth. It's causing a problem for propaganda at home because the main way in which the general population here has been kept under control for the last 50 years is the Russian threat. You can't waive it anymore. In fact, the invasion of Panama was very interesting in this respect. It's so typical an operation of U.S. violence that it barely, merits a footnote. But it was different in one respect. It's the first act of U.S. international violence in 50 or 60 years that hasn't been justified on the pretext that we're defending ourselves from the Russians. So when we invaded Grenada or the Dominican Republic or whatever, we're defending ourselves from the Russians. There weren't any Russians, but at least they were over there. We can say we're defending ourselves from them. This time, that was beyond the imagination even of the editorial writers in the State Department. So they had to set up a whole new propaganda framework. And in fact, it's interesting the way it worked. This problem was foreseen a couple of years ago. And as soon as the United States decided that Noriega, who had been their thug for decades, they decided that he was getting too independent and he had to go. The media took the cue and they began a process of demonization. He's a minor criminal by the standards of the people the United States supports. He looks like a choir boy. But they turned him into the major monster since Attila the Hun. The drug war, which is a complete hoax in my opinion. Drugs is a serious problem, but the drug war is not directed to it. The drug war is largely designed as a way of controlling the American population. Can't terrify them by the Russians, terrify them by, narco something or other. This was used. So Noriega is a minor figure in the drug system, less significant than George Bush, for that matter, and certainly less significant than the bankers who were being put back into power in Panama. But he became, he was somehow turned into the center of the international drug cartel. Well, this huge propaganda operation has been going on for a couple of years, and by the time they've tried various ways to get rid of Noriega, because he was too independent, and Panama has to be under a docile, pliable government so that we control the canal and so on. By the time they decided to invade, Ted Koppel could get up and say he's a member of the fraternity of international villains who Americans love to hate. Sure, after several years of demonization. Why did they love to hate him in 1989 and 1985 when he was our boy? He's just as much of a thug then as he is now. Ted Koppel didn't ask that question, because to ask that question would be immediately to see the necessary illusions crumble. Well, that's the kind of problem that the U.S. propaganda system is facing and will continue to face, with the inability to conjure up the Russian threat whenever it's needed to justify more military spending at home or more intervention overseas or whatever.
Professor Chomsky, I'm afraid we're out of time. I very much appreciate your comments and the questions from our audience. It's our hope that this evening will give people perspective on the news and where it originates, and also an opportunity to look at the news and the information we all receive every day in enormous quantities, not from a jaded perspective, but from an informed perspective on where that information may originate and the impact that it has on our lives. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Sev Corson, and good night.